I just find Moses so impressive, and what we've seen so far is a man who is not perfect. Perhaps he struck down that Egyptian in an anger management issue. He went through a stage of depression in the wilderness. He feels that he's been totally crushed, and yet he's able to give up on self and flesh and engage in this fantastic teamwork that we finished up on last time, where he was the arm of God revealed. And I don't know if you can remember last week, where he stood there before that divided Red Sea, allowing the nation to leave the land of sin and death and cross over into the wilderness and the travels towards the land. And as he stood there with his right arm raised, the verses confuse whose right arm it is. Some verses say it's by Moses' right arm, and other verses say it's by God's right arm. The two are one and the same. There's this fantastic teamwork that starts to happen in the life of this man who is able to empty himself of self and be obedient to God in all things. So this is this amazing teamwork we see, and there's hope for every one of us. We may not be fantastic in this world. We may even go through stages where we realise that we're not that great and we make failures. But God's teamwork in our lives with us can actually do wonders. It can be the definition of true greatness. And I think that's why Moses is so excited for what's about to happen. Because see, the lesson, the biggest turning point in his life, I suggest so far, was the burning bush. That what it showed him is, if God is within you, if God is the power in your life, you can't be destroyed. You're indestructible. The fire cannot touch you. And now he's going to the same place to bring Israel there. He's going to take them to the mountain. Now, there's an interesting term that's used. It doesn't say that Moses went by the way of the wilderness. It says that Moses took the people by the way of Sinai. Now, the commentators tell us there's no such road name. If you pulled out a road map of the day, not that there was such a thing, there'd be the way of the Philistines, the way of the plain down near the coast, and there'd be the way of the wilderness, but there's no road called the way of Sinai. So why is he putting this name on it? And the answer is Sinai means the place of the bush. He's deliberately bringing the people to have the same experience that he had. And often we do this in our ecclesial life, where something has inspired us, perhaps a study, a particular book, some experience in our lives of going and doing mission work has encouraged and inspired us, and we'd love to share that with our brothers and sisters because it's life-changing. I think for Moses, that inspiration of the burning bush, the fact that if God is within us, if we are God manifest, we're indestructible. The real greatness is that God can work through us when all the flesh is gone, and he wanted to share that with his people. So he brings them to the same place. Oh, and I guess, by the way, he'd been asked to do that. That's exactly what he'd been asked to do, is bring them to the same place where he saw the burning bush. So I think he's very excited to bring them there. Now, we don't have time to go through in great detail, unfortunately, all of the details of the story of the wilderness wanderings. The point of this study is to look at Moses. We've got the Red Sea crossing that we looked at in chapter 14 of Exodus, 15, the Song of Moses, 16, the manna in the wilderness, and these are just summaries. There's a lot more to some of these chapters. The first striking of the rock at Rephaim, the war with Amalek at chapter 17, the appointing of judges over Israel, and Israel's arrival at Sinai, chapter 19. And I'm going to suggest to you that he arrives with great excitement, and he goes up and he has the first ascent into the mount, and he comes back with this message from God. So Moses goes up into the Mount Sinai. There's no visible sign that God is there at this point, and he goes up and he comes back with this message. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. So that would have been very thrilling for Moses. He's being told that God will be the God of all these people. They can each individually be like priests, people who belong to him and serve him in their lives. This is what Moses was after. He's encouraged by this in his life. He can see how this can be shared with the nation, and he's all enthusiastic about this. So come back with me, if you will, to Exodus chapter 20, or 19 we'll start with. So he's gone up, he's come back, and he's all enthusiastic. He tells the people, prepare yourselves, tomorrow's a big day. We're going to see God and meet with, well, not going to see God, but we're going to meet with God on the next day. And Moses is all delighted about this because the message of the burning bush and the ideas will be conveyed to the people. So he's ready for that. Now, I'll just give you a little outline at this point of what actually it looked like. It's not what you would have really wanted for the people to feel close to God. It's a very good representation of the burning bush. You don't just have a bush that's burning and can't be destroyed. You've got an entire mountain on fire. So they come here and they see verse 16, thunders, lightnings, a thick cloud. It's like billowing smoke coming out of a furnace. There's Deuteronomy 4 adds to the picture and says it was a thick darkness, a fire that burned into the midst of heaven. Now, I just struggle to picture that. It's not just that the mountain was on fire. It was like, I don't know, some whirlwind of fire going up into the actual sky itself, as if there was some portal opened in the heavens itself and a fiery tornado leading from the mountain straight up into the sky. It's you were not just in the presence of a special effect in some sort of film. This was the real deal. This was a miracle of epic proportions right there in front of you. Hebrews 11 says there was a tempest. So the entire surroundings around the mountain, it would have been hard to stand, and the whistling wind around their ears would have shown them just how small and insignificant they were. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. So the very person who knew in his heart that he'd been brought there as a mission is now terribly afraid. God's reply to Moses, when Moses went forward and spoke to God, there's a voice comes back, a reply to Moses, and even though the words of that initial reply go unrecorded, Hebrews 12 says that the earth shook. This was an absolutely terrifying experience. If you imagine yourself there, it would have been so horrendously frightful. You would have felt that you were in the presence of the raw elements of the earth being unveiled, and that it could swallow you up in a moment, and that your human body was an incredibly fragile tiny ant in front of all of that. That at any moment you could get engulfed and destroyed. And out of this comes the 10 Commandments. The voice comes down from God, and the 10 Commandments come through to the nation, giving them laws, and the famous 10 Commandments, which are going to be so instrumental in the nation. And what do? Now here's the sad bit. They've been given all of this. It's like an enormous version of the burning bush. They've been given the first step in God's laws, the foundation stone, if you like, of the law, which was the 10 Commandments, and just come to Exodus 20, verse 18. The people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said to Moses, speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. Now this is tragic. Basically what's happened is Moses' whole work has been to bring them to the meeting with God, and they back away and say, we don't want to talk to him anymore. We're afraid of him. We don't want to actually have any dealings with this God. Now, I just want to explore for a moment the flaws in their thinking and the answer that Moses gives. It's actually, there's a little life-changing principle here, which I think is really worth exploring. So, what is their problem? Well, their problem is that they see the thunders, They saw it. See that in verse 18? It's about what they see. They are not getting attached to God. They're not understanding the significance. They're basically going on what they can see. And if you want to underline the word saw, it only is twice in verse 18, but just make it stand out for you that was their problem. It's what they saw. It just puts you in mind of Peter. Remember walking on the water? And Peter was all good until he looked and saw the waves that could engulf him, and he was afraid. He was fearful. Now, what Moses says makes no sense at all initially. Just look at this. There's perhaps one of the big principles we want to get out of tonight. Exodus 20, verse 20. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God has come to prove you that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. Now that makes no sense at all. He's basically said, don't be afraid. God's doing this so that you're afraid. He's contradicting himself, isn't he? Well, there's a wonderful principle that's well worth understanding in this particular statement of Moses. It's a brilliant insight into how Moses viewed the fear of God. He makes one point there, that ye sin not. There's a definite benefit in the fear of God, because the fear of God helps us to be careful not to do the wrong thing. Proverbs 16, by mercy and truth iniquity is purged. The fear of Yahweh helps people to depart from evil. It's a very beneficial thing. But just go back, this two fears business, I just want to dig into that a little deeper, because I suggest that through the Bible there are two fears. And it's like you can only be one fear or the other. You can't, there's no third road. This is one of those there's no third road things. You know how it says there's a straight way and a narrow way? There's no middle road. You can't be 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in the truth. There's no such thing. It's either the straight and narrow road or the broad road. Well, okay, with fear, there's two fears in Scripture, and you're either one or the other. What are they? Well, they are the fear of God. Sorry, I seem to have lost that. Let's go down here. There we are. Fear of death and the fear of God. So the fear of death is that you are afraid of dying. Why are you afraid of dying? Because your natural self, your sinful self says, I might miss out. I could miss out on some enjoyment of the flesh that we could have, so therefore I need to get out there and enjoy the day. Make the most of what the flesh and sin can give me today, because one day I'm going to die. Whereas the fear of God is different. You don't actually fear death, because God's going to bring you out the other side of death. What you fear is rejection by God and God's punishments. Just look at this quote here in Hebrews, and this is perhaps the most famous quote about the fear of death, and I feel that this cements it. What was the work of Christ? That through death he might destroy him that has the power of death. That is the devil, the tempter, the problem of sin inside us, and deliver them through fear of death, there's our phrase, were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So see the problem we've got, the problem of human nature goes like this, that you might as well be chained, because all these people out there in the world, and sometimes we fall into their mistakes, they get up in the morning and they think, how am I going to enjoy my life? Life is short. One day I'm going to die, so what shall I do? I'll rush out and get a career and make loads of money, because then I'll be happy. And after some time they realise that doesn't work, so they go and buy an iPad, and then they rush out and buy another car, and all these things they're in bondage to. They're slaves to all the things that the Gentiles lust after. Why? Because life is short. Go get it while you can and get what the flesh desires. That's called the fear of death, and that's the symptoms of it. We're commanded to have the other fear, the fear of God. Now, I'll just whip back to that quote. You can see that is what Moses is saying. Don't be afraid that God's going to destroy you, but don't have the fear of death. Have the fear of God in your minds. So there's this different principle. Okay, here's the second thing that they failed to understand. The two fears principle, they didn't get it. But the other thing they didn't understand is that God was actually trying to do this for their own good. Now here's my Deuteronomy quote that I went to by mistake earlier. Deuteronomy 4 verse 10, especially that day that thou stoodest before Yahweh thy God in Horeb, when Yahweh spake unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them to hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. What do you notice about that? God intended them to fear so that they live, and their children. So they're afraid because they're afraid they're going to die. And they didn't realise what God was trying to do. It was for their own good. The whole reason I'm putting the fear in you is so that you are going to choose life, the life that I've given you, and walk in my ways. It's for your good. So they failed to understand this. I mean, who wouldn't? It was a very frightening experience, but with some careful thought and looking at what Moses said, it would have been good if they could have actually understood that and learnt that lesson. You see, I guess what the burning bush taught is that flesh must be destroyed. And I guess the fiery mount teaches the same thing. That the self that is flesh, the serpent thinking inside, does have to be burnt away. But if we're God manifest, the word of God lasts forever. We need not fear death at all. But the fleshly nature that we have is going to be destroyed. It's something to think about some more as you go to bed tonight. Have a think about those two fears and ask yourself, which of those do I fear from the most? Which side am I? The fear of God is not actually painted in Scripture as being a bad thing. In fact, we might come back later to the story of Malachi, where at the very end of the Old Testament, the end of the Mosaic era, if you like, the big question they have is, where is your fear? You've got no fear, and the problem of Malachi was, therefore, they wouldn't be turned in their hearts back to God. We'll come back to that quote that mine's already going there, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. So God was stuck. When people reject God, he's got no option. It's like Cain. Once you actually say to God, I will not accept forgiveness, there's nothing more he can do. And so God is in this position where the people have backed away from him and said, we don't want this. He added no more. At this point, he gave them the tables and he didn't add any more. Imagine Daniel, or one of those prophets who was sick because he wanted to know more. He would have been horrified at what they'd just done, that they'd led God to a point where he chose to show them no more. And then Moses goes away. In fact, I'll go back to the slide I got a little way back here. There were 7 ascents into the mount, and they're not quite fitting on the slide, so I'll see if I can just fit them on there. A little bit more. There we go. It might be a bit small, but I can give you some notes on this afterwards if you're interested. There's actually 7 ascents into the mount. That first one was the one where he went up and came back with a message about them being a kingdom of priests. And then there was actually one more before the fire. I kind of made it sound like the next day was the coming of the... I will make it a little bigger. I can see some people really squinting there. To come back to tell them, the third one, when Moses goes up, is the fiery ascent. They've said they don't want to talk, and Moses goes up into the mount itself. There's a kind of partial ascent in Exodus 20, when he drew near to communicate with the people. And then there's a staged ascent in chapter 24, where he goes up with the elders and has a fellowship meal. And then what we hope to deal with later on is the two at the end, Exodus 32 and Exodus 34, where he goes up to offer his life for the life of the people, and also to ask for the show me thy glory moment. So there's these different ascents into the mount. The interesting one is, that we're going to deal with now, is that he goes up on about the third or fourth ascent. He's up in the mount for some time. And during that time, they turn around and make a golden calf. And God turns to Moses and says, go get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They've made a molten calf and have worshipped it and has sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And Yahweh said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. So what's amazing, I find incredible about this, is they'd learnt nothing about the fear of God because they built the golden calf while the fire's still going. The mount was still in fire and smoke, while they're underneath this fiery mountain building a golden calf. They've learnt nothing about the fear of God at all. And it's just a tribute to the resilience of the fleshly nature that we all bear, that we could be that stupid, that you could actually stand under a fiery mount and build a golden calf. I mean, yeah. And the idea that they had was that they didn't really want this harsh God who was so stern and severe. They wanted something a little bit more fun. And I think that's reflected in the actual choice that they had of a particular idol to worship. They picked the golden calf. Now, unfortunately, I lost my picture that I've got of the golden calf that we've got in the Adelaide Museum. We've got a little tiny one, and it's obviously not gold, we couldn't afford that, but we have a Hathor. So if you're taking the kids into the Adelaide Museum and you want to go into the Egyptian exhibit, have a look. We've got Hathor, the golden calf. Here's another version similar to what you'll see, and you'll notice that this was the goddess of music and dancing, and it had a special fertility symbol. You can see this on its back here. There's this necklace thing going around its back, and there's a funny looking, you can just make it out, this little box on its back, and it was a really fun, happy sort of occasion. What they used to do was have this game where you had to leap up and try and touch that particular emblem, the little symbol on its back, and that would give some sort of good luck to you. It was like a good luck charm. So when you read about the people, that they were leaping and dancing, they were actually leaping on the golden calf. That's what they were doing. They were actually jumping up and trying to touch this thing. So it would have been a very fun sort of thing to do. And it seems that the people who had learned nothing about the fear of God that makes you flee from sin, and they were just wanting a good time. They sat down to keep the feast of Yahweh, but then they rose up to play. Now, when we hadn't got time to go through in Deuteronomy how the angel of Yahweh seems incredibly worked up and upset about this, and it actually uses the expression, let me alone, that I can destroy these people, and I'll make another people, a greater people from thee, Moses. And it says at that point that Moses actually restrained the Yahweh angel. He actually, as it were, wrestled with the angel himself. Therefore he said that he would destroy them, had not Moses his chosen stood before him in the breach and turned away his wrath, lest he should have destroyed him. So that's the psalm that's actually referring to this particular incident of the golden calf, where Moses actually restrained the angel and stopped him from destroying the people. And Yahweh said unto Moses, Go, get thee down unto this people, which thou hast brought out of the land of Egypt. They have corrupted themselves. So the Yahweh angel puts it on Moses' shoulder. He's the representative. He's taking responsibility for this nation. It's on your shoulders, Moses. Go fix the problem. It's a pretty drastic sort of moment here. This expression here, it says that he was in the breach. The word in the breach is a military term where those lads down the back are interested in military stuff. When they had a siege, there was a brick or a wall, and the soldiers in there would hide behind the wall until someone managed on the outside to break a hole in the wall. And then it would take a very brave and someone who was going to probably get medals for it, soldier to stand in the breach. And it's the expression means someone stands in the gap and fights off all the forces, because all the enemy soldiers have to crowd through that one gap. So to stand in the breach is an incredibly brave thing to do, where you're saying you put yourself on the line to defend this particular, in this case, this nation. Now, it says also in here, I just want to pick up this expression, which you're probably familiar with, is that they are a stiff-necked people. Now, it's not actually in this verse, so where have I put that? It's actually in verse 9. So if you wanted to come across to Exodus 32, and we'll probably take it from here now through Exodus 32 and 33. You see, Yahweh says that this is a stiff-necked people. I just want to pick up on that word stiff-necked. It's actually, there's an interesting, it's an interesting expression. It means to show someone the back of the neck, and it's a rebellious and I think the modern expression would be talk to the hand. So if you've got sick of someone completely and you say, look, talk to the hand, you turn away and you show them, no, you turn away from them in an expression that says, I'm not going to talk to you. It's a complete contrast to what Moses actually does when he first comes to the bush himself. Moses is, I suggest, in the depths of despair in the wilderness with his sheep in the days of his Midianite experience, and he sees a burning bush and he is turned aside to learn that lesson of the burning bush. And that's life-changing. He's turned to see this miracle that God's done in his life. Well, these people will not turn. That's what stiff-necked actually means. And it becomes an actual play on words through the story of the wilderness wanderings and Moses' interaction with the people. That they're stiff-necked. They won't turn around to actually pay attention, to have their lives changed. And once you get this idea, there's actually several references to it. That quote we were looking at sort of in passing a little while back, the quote about in Malachi, where you've gone through the whole of the story of the Mosaic era, you get to the end and the nation has failed because they wouldn't learn the fear of God, they wouldn't learn his law. And Malachi 4 verse 4 to 6 says, remember ye the law of Moses my servant. There's the summary you need at this particular juncture. He's a servant, he's obedient, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel with statutes and judgments. Behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh. He shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come to smite the earth with a curse. Isn't that what happened to Moses? Remember when he turned to the burning bush, what was the first words that God said to him at the burning bush? I'm the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And Moses was turned to the God of his fathers and inspired by the lesson of God manifestation that the patriarchs had actually learnt from. And yet all the way through you find that they would not turn, even right at the end of the time of the Acts, when the nation of Israel, he brings against them the accusation of Isaiah and says, you're a stiff-necked people. Isaiah said the right thing. You wouldn't hear, lest you be converted. And it's the final closing condemnation at the very close of the book of Acts. So Moses comes down and he brings the judgments of God first, and he brings destruction on them. So Moses besought Yahweh and said, Yahweh, why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt with thy great power and thy mighty hand? So he speaks to appease God initially, and then he goes down and he calls for the Levites to, who is on my side? The Levites step forward and they go through and they slay 3,000 men. It's a tragic moment that the failure of the people to take on God's commandment cost them 3,000 men because they would not turn in their hearts. You're probably aware of this, and I'll just allude to it in passing, that there's a contrast being made across Scripture, that 3,000 people are lost because their hearts would not be turned at the giving of the law. But at the coming of Christ and the day of Pentecost, 3,000 souls were baptised, were saved. Why? Because they were pricked in their hearts. See the difference? The difference was these people would not allow their hearts to be touched. They could not be touched by God's offer of help in their lives. Now I want you to just start looking closely at this chapter. If you've got this chapter in front of you, I want you to go through and we'll just start looking at the pronouns. just look who God blames. And this becomes a play that goes on right through the chapter. It's worth noting, and if you want to underline some of this, it makes it stand out. Look at verse 7. Yahweh, that's the Yahweh angel, said to Moses, "Get thee down, for thy people which thou broughtest." Moses hadn't brought them out on his own might. He hadn't done the plagues by his own strength. And Moses actually responds. Look at Moses' response, where he actually corrects this and says, yes, he's willing to take the blame, and he says, yes, they're a stiff-necked people, but look, verse 11, middle of the verse, "Why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought out of the land of Egypt?" So Moses corrects that and says, they're your people, God. God's disowning the people at this point. And I think that's the point we've got to take from this, is God saying, I'm distancing myself from you and the people that you represent, Moses. Moses tries to correct it, but at this point, that something more has to be done. So then we have, it's in verse 28 that we have the death of the 3,000. That's the first thing that has to be done. And now Moses, having brought about the death of the 3,000, now goes back up to talk to God again. And he returns to God and he says, "Oh, this people have sinned a great sin. They have made them gods of gold. Yet now, if thou wilt forgive their sin..." And Yahweh, just have a look at verse 31, because I haven't got the full verse there. He says, verse 32, "Yet now, if thou wilt forgive their sin..." Look at that big line in the verse. I think that's a pause. And it's one of the biggest pauses in Scripture where Moses is thinking through a lot of what this actually means. He's realising that people don't deserve to be forgiven. There's no compulsion on God's part. They've been given everything, and they've sinned and turned away from God when everything's been given to them. "And if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written." So here's this moment where Moses offers himself as an offering to God. It's an amazing gesture. He's not just asking that God just punish him. He's asking to be blotted out of thy book. Now we know in Scripture, if we make a study of the books, there's two books. There's the book of lives and the book of life. So one book is about the story of everyone's day. So it records the story of everybody's life. But the other one has the names of those that are God's, that are his when the day when he will make up his jewels. They are his saints. They're the ones that are going to be saved. He's offering his name in that book. He's saying, if this can act as a payment, blot my name out of that book. Now what he's offering is not accepted by God, and there's good reason for that, because this is not the method of atonement that God actually requires. This is a brilliant argument. If you're ever doing a lecture on the church doctrine of substitution, here's a great way to prove it, that God doesn't accept substitution, where substitution means that someone else can pay for the sins of a people. The church teaches that Jesus paid for our sins instead of us. Here's Moses basically offering that. And it's a beautiful gesture, but it's not how God works, and it's not what God wants, and that's not what God accepts in this particular time. So it's a brilliant proof that God doesn't accept that as a method of atonement for anyone. So now he decides that he's going to achieve an atonement further for the people. He's going to bring God and the people back together. And just looking at chapter 33, "And Yahweh said unto Moses, Depart, and go up thence, thou and the people which thou hast brought up out of the land of Egypt, unto the land which I swear unto Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and unto thy seed will I give it." So God's basically saying, I will still perform the promises, but I'm still distanced from you. You can go up to that land, but it's not actually going to be with me. Look at verse 3. unto a land that floweth with milk and honey, for I will not go up in the midst of thee, for thou art a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in the way. So see that way of using the word thou? He's addressing Moses and the people as one entity. Thou art a stiff-necked people. He's saying, all right, Moses, if you want to identify with the people, I will still fulfill the promises to Abraham, as I have said, but it's you that's a stiff-necked people. Off you go. Now there's an interesting verse here in the reaction of the people, because Moses obviously took this message to the people of Israel and taught them, explained to them what was going on and how God was distancing himself from them. But there's an interesting order in which the way these next two verses are put together. See, it's verse 5 that says, For Yahweh said unto Moses, Say unto the children of Israel, Ye are a stiff-necked people, and I will come up in the midst of thee in a moment and consume thee. Therefore now put off thy ornaments from thee, that I may know what to do to thee. And the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments. But you notice in verse 4, the order seems to be reversed in the sort of commandment and the action. And when the people heard the evil tidings, they mourned, and no man put on his ornaments. So see that even before the commandments come out, they're doing what the commandments said. What's going on here? And what were these ornaments to start with? Well, the ornaments were all the things that they picked up as they left Egypt, remember? The Egyptians gave them all these ornaments of gold and so forth, and if we dig into what ornaments come out of Egypt, they're all to do with idolatry. They're all symbols of some god or other made of gold. And so these Israelites had come out wearing all these trinkets that were trinkets of idolatry because it was fashionable jewellery where they'd come from. And it looked really good. And they kept saying it doesn't affect us. Actually, look, wearing this jewellery which is to the goddess such and such, or this necklace that I've got from so-and-so, doesn't affect me. It doesn't really, I wear it, but it doesn't change my dedication to the truth. Well, all of a sudden, when their life's on the line and they really see it, they get up the next morning and can't put them on. How fascinating is that? How many things are there in our life, don't answer this question out loud, that are the trinkets of this world? And we keep saying to ourselves, it doesn't affect us. No, it doesn't affect us. Look, the fact that I've got this fancy this or that, or I spend my time doing this or that, it doesn't affect me. Really, it doesn't. And the morning that your life's on the line, and something in your life brings you face to face with the reality of God and life and death, that's the morning that you can't look sideways at that gadget, that thing, that trinket of this world. This is what is happening here. The people have been suddenly brought face to face with the reality that God might not be their God anymore. Just think about it. We almost take it for granted that we're God's people. What if you suddenly realise that maybe from now on you wouldn't be? You're on your own. Now where are you going to go for salvation from death itself? What hope have you got now? Being cut off from God is a terrible and fearful thing. And the realisation of the position they stood in made them voluntarily get rid of their ornaments, all the trinkets of this Egyptian life, before the commandment even was issued. Now look what Moses does, is he takes the tabernacle and he pitched it without the camp, verse 7, afar off from the camp, and he called it the tabernacle of the congregation. So Moses, we could go into all the New Testament references to this about going without the camp, but what's being told here is the Israelites are being told God's distancing himself from you. The tabernacle, which was supposed to be the place of God's presence in the nation, is now over there. It's not in your midst anymore. You thought you were the burning bush because God is in your midst. Well, he's not now. He's outside the camp. He's over there. So the people were very afraid by this. And actually it says that they stood every man, look at verse 8, and all the people rose up and stood every man at his tent door and looked after Moses until he had gone unto the tabernacle. It's funny because the expression stood every man in his tent door gets used quite a few times through the wilderness wanderings to describe the way they stood there having a whinge and a complain, but not this time. This is where they stood there, understanding that on that man's life depended the entire life of the nation. And they saw that one man, Moses, get up and walk out to that tent outside the camp. And if he got struck dead, it's all over. If God decided to strike down Moses, they're gone. He is the slender thread by which their life hangs. And that's how they viewed their, shall we call him, Messiah in that moment. How do we view ours? Do we come on a Sunday morning and view with the same understanding that by a slender thread our life hangs, our hopes hang on the one man that we come to remember on a Sunday morning? We are 100% reliant on him. And so he goes out there, and it says this beautiful thing, verse 11, that Yahweh spake unto Moses face to face, as a man spake unto his friend. There's going to be some straight talking that goes on here. Now, we've been following through the pronouns. That God says, it's your people, Moses, and you are a stiff-necked people. Just have a look at how Moses now starts to draw this discussion in. And it might not seem at first. You go through this section in Exodus 34, you don't spot it unless you're looking for these personal pronouns. Once you start looking at the personal pronouns, and if you want to colour them in, it makes the story really come alive. Look at verse 13. So Moses speaks. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. So see, what Moses is doing is he's turning this around, and he's saying to God, it's about me. You've got a relationship with me. If my relationship is good enough, then accept the people who I represent. And at first, God says, verse 14, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. Moses, I accept that I'm with you. Moses, that's as far as it goes. And he said, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up thence. Basically what he's pointing out is, we're inseparable. I and the people are one. I'm associating myself with the people that I'm coming to represent. Look, if you're seeing Christ in this, you should be. What a magnificent thing. Look at Christ, or Moses here, associating with the people. They're in trouble, they've sinned, and he's appealing to God to consider them as one. Verse 16, for wherefore shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Well, there's a change. So verse 13, it was, if I have found grace in thy sight. Now, verse 16, if I and thy people have found grace in thy sight, is it not that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. See the way it's emphasised, how he keeps repeating this I and thy people business. Verse 17, and Yahweh said to Moses, I will do this also which thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. And then he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And he said, I will make my goodness to pass before thee, and I'll proclaim the name of Yahweh before thee, and I'll be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. Now, something struck me as very interesting about that idea. We teach it in Sunday school, and we teach it in First Principles a lot, about this quote here, about seeing God's glory. And we rightly point out the connection between the glory and the name and the character of God. What is the glory? The glory is, verse 19, I will be merciful to whom I will be merciful. And how is that explained? The Yahweh angel came down and declared, verse 5 of 34, the name of Yahweh. And the name of Yahweh is this twofold character. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. Yahweh Elohim, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant, goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression and sin. But, here's the other side, will no means clear the guilty, and visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And we always talk about the fact that there's a balance in God's character. a balance that's unachievable by humans except for Christ. And there's that beautiful story there in this. But if we're studying Moses, we may have overlooked something. You see, let me just point this out. In verse 18, he says, "Show me thy glory." Why is he even asking for that? And here's a point. They've already seen it. When the fire descended on the mount is described as God's glory. What's Moses asking for? To have the fire on the mount come down again? I mean, that's what put the people off in the first place. Or does he realise that there's another side to God's glory? God's glory is not just in earthquake, wind, fire, and tempest, but it's in mercy. It's in having mercy and being gracious to people. And Moses recognises that the glory of God is twofold. There's a brilliance of enormous fire and displays of light and so forth on the mount, but the real glory of God is to have mercy on whom he will show mercy to show his character in the way he forgives. So this is the glory. Moses is saying the people of Israel saw what they thought was the glory, but there's a whole nother depth to the glory of God, and I know what that is, and I appeal to that. Show me your real glory. And God says, it's about mercy. Now, if you think, oh yes, okay, but is that really what Moses is after? Just look, when you look, it's buried in there. Look at verse 6. Verse 7. Exodus 34, verse 7. There's a funny little expression in there that you wouldn't expect. He keepeth mercy for thousands. Is buried right in the middle of the 11 points that are there in those characteristics. Right at the centre. And if you're a fan of the companion Bible, you know that centres can be an interesting thing. He keeps mercy for thousands. If you wanted to demonstrate God's mercy, why didn't you say keepeth mercy for billions? Why did it only get limited to thousands? And the answer is because Israel was divided into thousands and they were called the thousands of Israel. So when it got to the end of the day, Moses would stand up there and he would call for God to return to the thousands of Israel at the end of their journey. So what Moses is asking for is the real glory of God, and as that is God's ability to forgive whoever he chooses to forgive. Show me that glory, says Moses. And God shows it to him, saying, I will keep mercy for even the thousands of Israel who've been so rebellious against me. By the way, one last little thing in this little section before we finish up perhaps tonight is that he's told that he will see God's glory in physical seeing, but he doesn't see all of it. He will, in verse 23, but my face shall not be seen. Do you know that is fascinating because it also fits in with this idea of turning to face someone. You know, there's another sort of theme that we could follow through and we haven't got time to, where it talks about seeking thy face. That someone who turns to God, who's not stiff-necked, who doesn't show the back of the neck, but who turns to seek God, will seek his face. And who is it who is able to truly seek his face? Well, the Psalms show us that it's actually only Christ who will do this. Psalm 17, verse 15, we haven't got time to go there. As for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I will be satisfied when I awake with thy countenance. So the position of Moses is to seek God's mercy. And he can only go so far. It's for Christ in the future to go that next step. So if you're wondering why it is that Moses wasn't granted to see the face of God, it's because that's reserved for the greater mediator to come who will seek the face of God on behalf of us. So there's an amazing thing that's going on here, and it's so much deeper than what we've seen before. You know, just the mighty acts that are done on Egypt, the mighty fire that came down on the mount. There's a whole lot greater depth of character and personality in a God who's drawn to this man who says he's willing to sacrifice himself, who associates himself with the people he comes to save, and who seeks earnestly for the real glory of God, which is his ability to show mercy. We have to wind up tonight, and as you can tell, I have loads more stuff that would be lovely to talk about. But I did want to finish just on a couple of things. There's the rest of the law that's given from this point through the story here, and much of the rest of the story of the wilderness wanderings and the records we've got here about the law. And it's as if God and Moses both present two ways of resolving the problem. This is God's way. And Yahweh says, Yahweh thy God shall raise up unto thee a prophet in the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him shall ye hearken, according to all that thou desiredst of the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. So the people had said, we don't want to hear God anymore. God's answer to that was, I'm going to raise up a prophet like unto Moses. Who is this prophet that's referred to? Well, he's the one that they would hear, the one that's going to turn their hearts again. And that was the classic phrase about Christ. You find him over and over again saying, To him that hath ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith. So he was a man in his first coming who did the best possible opportunity for the nation to actually hear, because he spoke to them without fire from heaven, without all these great shows and displays. He spoke the still small voice. There's God's solution to the problem of the nation that won't hear. He's going to send someone who speaks words that change their hearts. Now, sadly, Israel wouldn't listen, and they wouldn't hear Christ, but those words are still there for us. That if you find yourself struggling with learning the fear of God and being in that position that you should be, of fearing God and choosing not to fear death, turn to the words of Christ, who can help you with this, because that's what we're told. His words will be the thing that bring the solution of bringing you closer to God. And I think also Moses now brought a solution to the nation to try and make them hear. He brought the schoolmaster, the law. And, so much of what's in the law is wrapped up in this idea of the tabernacle. Now, that's a bit of an odd picture there, but perhaps you can just see there's two pictures overlaid on top of each other. One is the Garden of Eden, and you can see the tree of life in the background here, and the cherubim with the flaming sword here. And what there was a pathway coming through between the cherubim to come into the place of the tree, the place where you could be in the presence of God. And Moses developed this new version of this that mimicked the same story, called the tabernacle. You had the most holy place in here, where only the high priest could go. You had the holy place here, where the priests and Levites could go. And if you brought an offering, any of the common people could come here with the Levites and make a sacrifice. But the story of this particular layout is the same as the Garden of Eden. That what you did is you came through into this most holy place to be in the presence of God. The story of that, the lesson of that was laid out for the people by that pictorial layout, if you like, was that they were there to try and develop a relationship with God and draw near to him themselves. So Moses, in a way, through this tabernacle, and I know it was God's doing of giving the law and the sacrifices, was laying out for them the same lesson that they should have learnt from the Mount of Fire itself. That if you sacrifice the flesh, if you get rid of the flesh and you draw near to God, you can be near God and not fear death, but fear God. There's the sacrifice at the altar, where obviously you got rid of the things of the flesh. There's a symbol of baptism, again, a washing away of the filth of the flesh. There's all the things of association that we have in this life with God, the fellowship of the showbread altar, the light of God's word in the lampstand, the incense altar of prayer, all the different things that make up our lives now. in order to slowly bring us towards that time where we're in full relationship with God, and symbolised by the holy place and the ark, which showed God's presence in the nation. Look, I've gone through that too quickly, and you're all aware that that's an enormous topic which would take quite some time. My main point is this, is that Moses was trying to, when the people turned away from God at the Mount, he's trying to give them other methods. The law was there as a schoolmaster to bring them to Christ. It was there to draw them back to a relationship with God that they'd initially rejected at the burning mount. What Moses wanted all his life was for them to have the same experience that he had, that if flesh can be done away with and you are truly God manifest, then you have nothing to fear in life. You can go through life without any fear whatsoever. And that's the hope that I believe Moses had for the nation, and the hope that they rejected. And I think it's encouraging for us all to go away and think about that idea of the two fears, but also, more importantly, of our mediator, who showed us the real glory of God, the real greatness of God, and that is his characteristic of mercy.